Hi, my name is Gay Douglas. Welcome to this video highlighting the findings of the Enhancing Transitions Client Perspectives project. We're going to be sharing the findings of this research project, some of the leading practices that were identified throughout the process, and some potential program impacts that we think will be of importance to Employment Ontario agencies. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with an overview of the project, and then we're going to move to the key findings. We ask the question, when it comes to the transition process or the referral process for clients, what really matters to them? And then we're going to take a look at the responses from staff when they were asked what matters about the transition and referral process for clients. Then we're going to compare what did they have in common? What were the commonalities between both groups' responses? And then where did they differ? I'd also like people to take a chance to reflect on their own practice and their own program, because there are pieces of these findings that could really impact how programs operate and how practitioners do their work. So let's get started with an overview of the project itself. The current project built on a previous project called Formalizing Transitions between Employment Services and Literacy and Basic Skills. That project was completed last year. This year's project, the Client Perspectives project, was a partnership of the Simcoe-Muskoka Literacy Network and the Movement for Literacy, Metro Toronto Movement for Literacy. It really studied the transition and referrals between Employment Ontario programs. They wanted to find out what works throughout the transition process from the client's perspective. What are the barriers that prevent people from having a smooth transition, and what might be some of the solutions? To find out the answers, we conducted 9 focus groups. We conducted 3 with the deaf stream programs, we conducted 2 with francophone programs, and we conducted 4 with anglophone programs. Before we go any further, I wanted to clarify 2 points that I'll be referring to throughout this presentation. The first one is that whether or not we spoke with learners active in a literacy and basic skills program or clients active in an employment services program, I may refer to them throughout this presentation as either clients or learners. We will not differentiate. Also, as part of the focus groups held with the deaf stream, we consulted with people who may have been deaf, deafened, or hard of hearing. So if I make reference to deaf focus groups, please be aware that those 3 types of people were actually consulted. In front of you, you will see a list of all of the site hosts who actually hosted the focus groups on our behalf. As you can see, there is a mix between urban and rural settings and agencies within the Metro Toronto Movement for Literacy catchment area and the catchment area of the Simcoe-Muskoka Literacy Network. Working with the project advisory group, we came up with these questions. We asked each of the focus groups the same questions, although we paraphrased based on our audiences and their responses to each question. First of all, we asked what job goals people may have that were participating in the group. We asked how people found the current program they were involved in and what that transition experience might have been like. We asked about other services that they were currently involved in and how transition and referral between those programs felt and what it looked like. We asked how the current program made the client's transition experience in more smooth, and we asked how we might be able to improve that experience. And then we asked for general comments. Let me say that at this point, it was very difficult to get clients to talk about their transition in. We believe that most happened so smoothly that they hadn't even recognized a transition had taken place. Before we talk about the findings of this particular project, let's look back to the previous project where agency staff were consulted about the important factors and characteristics that identified when clients were ready to move on. It looked at the transition points in a client's experience. It also looked at factors that might influence the transition readiness of a client. The project also collected a number of tools, resources, workshops, and practices that are used in Employment Ontario agencies across the province, such as screening and referral tools, service directories, planning and partnership activities, networking, workshops, and information sharing that's taking place. Co-location was identified as a key practice, and other resources that target employers, employees, and learners. If you'd like to take a look at the results of Phase 1, go to the link on this screen. This slide summarizes some of the key findings of the project, and please notice the key icon that appears next to some of the lines in the following slides. They will highlight some of the real key findings and most important, surprising things we learned throughout the project. So these key findings identified what mattered to clients, and to summarize, they are partnerships. 3 different elements of customer service, including environment, accommodations, and service delivery. Labor market information and co-location. Please note that co-location was identified both by program staff in Phase 1 and by the clients in Phase 2 as an important practice for easing their transitions. In the following slides, we will look at each of these pieces separately. Okay, so let's start looking at partnerships. Clients talked about facilitated referrals and the beauty of being able to have a trusted practitioner refer them personally to another program or service. They talked about the importance that practitioners and program staff were aware of other community agencies, both within the Employment Ontario system and beyond. They talked about the value of the directory of services that were available in some communities, where wraparound services, employment, training, and self-employment programs were all listed together. Some made reference to itinerant offices, so organizations that allowed agencies to come and set up on a temporary basis in open space within their setting. They talked about guest speakers and how helpful it was to have people from other services come in to share information. And you'll notice the key icon next to tours. That was a surprise for our group. Many of the clients participating in these focus groups talked about their need to get out of their current program and explore through tours to other sites and other services in their community. Client and learner focus groups identified 3 elements of customer service that they said were important as part of their transition process. The first one they described was the environment, the need for a safe and welcoming and relaxed atmosphere that treated them like adults. They talked about the need for Employment Ontario staff to be professional and respectful of the client's needs at the same time as being personable and warm. Clients identified how important it was that staff identify that family and emotional issues came with the clients to the program every day. This is a quote from one of the focus group participants. "This program treats me like an adult. The training wheels are off for the first time. But it's really important that the atmosphere here be casual, comfortable, and compassionate." I think we should start calling those the 3 C's. Another point that our focus groups made, and this was a new one and a bit of a surprise, and that's why it has a key next to it, was the importance to have a single point of contact. So when a client contacted a program and they spoke to John, they wanted to know that from there on in, John would be their main point of contact. The second element of customer service, most often identified by the focus groups, was accommodations. And let me flag for you that that's beyond physical accommodations, such as elevators. Clients talked about the importance of having flexible times and days, of having program and agency staff understand that they had other duties and other responsibilities, such as family. It talked about the importance of having their communications preferences understood. For example, many clients and learners said they'd much rather receive a text or an email rather than use a telephone. It was also important that programs and agencies be aware of the accommodations needed and the resources available, and most often this was discussed by focus group participants in the deaf stream. Many of the participants in the deaf stream also identified the need for policy and protocol, not just in agencies, but in businesses, to ensure that appropriate accommodations were available. The final element of customer service, most often identified by the focus group participants, was service delivery itself. They talked about the importance of customizing approaches to each client's learning needs and individual situations. They talked about the importance of programs and services being self-paced and goal-directed so they could see the progress they were making. And even if they might be in an employment program with the ultimate goal of work, they talked about how important it was that what they're learning and what they're taking away can apply immediately to their life priorities. They also talked about how motivating it was to have certificates and have their progress recognized formally in some way. One of the pieces that came out of all the focus groups was the importance for clients to be self-aware and the chance throughout the programs they were experiencing to learn more about their strengths and their challenges, their learning styles, their goals. So they wanted it to be all about them. Another important tool in the transition of clients, particularly to work and employment or post-secondary, is labor market information. Many of the clients interviewed through the focus groups did not have access to that information or talked about how important it was that they did have access to that information. They wanted data on local jobs. They wanted to know who was hiring, what kind of credentials they needed for local jobs. They wanted to have an idea of jobs that were emerging and jobs that were declining. They wanted to understand labor market information, not just from their home communities, but other communities across Canada. When we're thinking about younger folks who may not have strong ties to their current community and commitments to their current community, we need to think about offering this information in other communities, from other communities, so that they can move to those jobs if they're willing. As staff had done in the first phase of this project, clients also identified co-location as an important practice in easing their transition. They talked about the need for services both within and beyond Employment Ontario being readily available. about the beauty of having a one-stop shop that offered health services, food support, information on childcare, so that they go to one place to get all their needs met. They talked about how valuable it was to be able to access that information in one place. And they also talked about the value of a common intake and assessment process, and that was a bit of a surprise to our team. Often, clients do not want to have to repeat the same information again and again, so they saw value in this process. I'd like to emphasize the findings in this particular slide, as they were a surprise to our team. Whether or not the focus group was taking place in a Francophone, Anglophone, or a deaf program, when asked to describe a transition into the current program, very few clients had any concerns or could identify barriers. In fact, in many cases, they hadn't even realized a transition had taken place, especially within an agency where two Employment Ontario programs may be co-located. It was often seamless to the client. However, when we asked about their transition exiting their current program, most Anglophone participants did not identify barriers, but many Francophone and deaf participants did. Let's take a closer look at the barriers identified at exit by the deaf and Francophone participants in the focus groups. Both the Francophone and deaf participants talked about the challenges of not having services available in their appropriate language, whether that language be French or ASL. And whether or not their next step was to the world of work or another service, they talked about the frustration of not having the necessary and available accommodations that they needed for that next step. They said that in many cases, services or employers were not aware of the resources available or willing to spend the time and effort and money necessary to accommodate them. They also identified a lack of policy, that in many cases, employers and services were not even close to being compliant with AODA and were unwilling to meet them where they needed to be met. In one particular case, there was a client in a deaf program who had already achieved 3 college diplomas, but kept coming back to the literacy and basic skills program. She talked about the revolving door and the doors that were closing on her. After the initial findings were collected, they were shared first at a town hall meeting in Barrie. The Simcoe Muskoka Literacy Network wanted to hear from their local service providers what they thought of the findings of this project. So they had some really great ideas and some common responses. They talked about how the results were not surprising, that from a client's point of view, they were simply describing good adult learning principles. They talked about the value of partnerships in service provision versus co-location, how a partnership is more like dating someone and a co-location is more like a marriage, and that it's often easier to have a partnership among a variety of agencies rather than be married. They talked about the need for additional funding if all of the needs of clients were going to be able to be satisfied. They talked about the value of a joint, streamlined intake form that perhaps they could agree upon in their community. Once we had the findings from the 9 focus groups that were held across the province where clients told us what was important, we thought it would be important to also look at what staff told us was important for transition from phase 1. We were able to generalize those statements under 3 main headings, and this is the first one. Even though they said it in different ways, program staff and clients were really describing the same thing: a safe, welcoming, respectful environment where a client can thrive. Staff are good at talking about client readiness for transition, about things like motivation and commitment and overcoming fears and feeling safe. Clients described their feelings throughout that process: to be supported, respected, the need for compassion in the program. Where they differed when discussing this particular element, staff were able to, and it was important for staff to talk about the demonstration of client readiness, whereas clients talked about the importance of a single point of contact. The second general point about which staff and clients could agree was the importance of personalized, practical, flexible, and goal-directed programming. So while staff talked about meeting clients' goals and skills, and the skills important to be able to move on, such as computer skills, problem-solving skills, and life skills, clients talked about the accommodations necessary and the service delivery characteristics that motivated them to move to the next step. Things like having the right equipment, the right technology, the right communications preferences acknowledged. Where they differed in terms of this particular element was staff once again identified what the clients did not around their skills needed for the next step. And clients identified, but staff did not, the link between the learning that they're having in their program and how it equates to their life in the current day. The final general element where clients and staff could agree was the importance of concrete plans, realistic goals, and information and access to next steps. Staff talked about specific tools and strategies such as directories, information sharing, co-location as strategies to reaching those goals. Clients talked about tools and strategies as well, but they were very clear that these needed to be responsive to clients' needs. Things like a common intake process, speakers, tours, and labor market information based on their individual requirements. Where they differed was that staff identified what should happen, and clients identified how it could happen in more specific terms. At this point, you may want to reflect with your colleagues about how these findings impact your program and the practices of your practitioners. What are you already doing that are satisfying the needs of clients? What might you do differently? What resources might you need to be able to do those practices differently? This project has produced some new resources for the field that will be shared over the next few weeks. First of all, there will be a revised guide to easing the transition of clients. It will include the comparison information between practitioner's point of view and client's point of view in terms of that process. We've also produced a poster we're calling the EASE checklist that talks about some of the most important factors and best practices, and it will be in the form of a large poster distributed to every Employment Ontario agency in the province. At the same time, we're conducting regional network consultations, sharing the results of the project and encouraging discussion among local groups. What is the impact on their community planning and their community service delivery? What are the impacts on their programs, on their actual practice and working with clients? There will also be a final report that will be produced once the project is completely wrapped up. This project has shed light on the most important stakeholder in the Employment Ontario system, the clients and learners that are served by the programs. We encourage you to go to the website listed on this slide to find out more and to locate the resources that were developed as part of this project. Thanks for your time, and we hope you will find this helpful.